If your practice works for you, then it's perfect.
This is a lifetime journey.
It's a very subjective thing.
If you choose for it to be so,
The ideal is a middle ground and a balance.
on the whole, it's not a job for most people.
What devotion looks like.
Learn what you're learning.
There are really no hard and fast rules.
Don't worry too much about other people.
Practice will evolve with time.
No shame.
You're gonna see various
Different things from your peers. It's okay.
You will eventually understand we're all on different parts of our journey.
To have that information is extremely valuable.
It's all relative.
You can use elements from those things and incorporate them into your practice instead of just having one stagnant thing.
I am Georgina.
I'm Nike.
You are listening to Occultism with a Side of Salt. Hello, this is Georgina Rose.
This is Nike.
This is Temperance.
And this is J. Allen Cross.
And welcome to Occultism with a Side of Salt. In this episode, we're going to be talking all about folk magic. So we're going to be talking about the whole issue, from what's the difference between witchcraft and folk magic, brujeria, Santa Muerte, the Christianity question of like, where does Christianity fall in this? Is Christian witchcraft a thing? Is Christian witchcraft just a fancy word for folk magic? The overlap of organized religions and folk magic, and all those cans of worms. So we're going to be beginning with, of course, defining folk magic and folk witchcraft, a term that Temperance sort of coined. I don't know if she coined it, but I hear it the most.
For sure did not coin it.
Temperance coined it.
Ha! I did not.
have, as intro meister, I have officially decided Temperance coined the term folk witchcraft, trademark it. So let's get started.
I would like to clarify that I did not coin the word folk witchcraft. I think, it probably came like as a natural progression because I practice folk magic and my brand's name is Wildwoman Witchcraft. So it just like the two words really went together well. But there are a number of witches who practice folk magic. I pretty much only practice folk magic, and I would classify myself probably as a witch, although I prefer to use the word practitioner. If someone were to call me a witch, I wouldn't like chew their heads off for it. So, to me, folk is just a descriptor in the same way that someone would say like I'm a green witch or I'm a hedge witch. Like folk is the actual descriptor of the style of magic that I'm working. I don't work ceremonial magic. I don't cast circles. I don't do rituals. I'm specifically doing targeted spell work for targeted incidents using folk styles and things that have been taught to me. And I do view it, because I'm no longer Christian, I've been a pagan for many years, I view it through the lens of paganism. So folk pagan kind of sounds weird. Folk witch sounds a little more understandable, a little easier to swallow. So I do think that it's probably a misnomer or like a bad term, but I think it gets the point across of what I'm trying to describe.
Absolutely. And also in this day and age, I think we've come to understand the fact that even though we approach it very differently and we use different vocabulary about it, witchcraft and folk magic, we're all essentially here for the same things. We're doing the same thing. We are lighting candles. We are saying the chants or the prayers or whatever it is to make something happen. We all kind of come at it from a different direction, use different language for it, but essentially we're all at the same table here.
Yeah, I mean, I think historically it had a much bigger distinction, because historically the term folk magic, because I think we talk about it right, like everyone gets the Christian hate comments, where like witches has a stigma, right? Witchcraft is associated with this very transgressive, dark, very, very Eurocentric thing. And historically, there'd be a huge distinction between someone you would call a witch and someone who's like the little surf village, like witch folk practitioner lady who like does little charms for you when you're sick or reads the Psalms while she makes a little like pouch, like there was a huge distinction between that person and the horrifying concept of the naked witches in the woods summoning, say, you know what I mean? Like historically, there'd be a very strong draw in the mud. In a lot of cultures there is, right? Like, I think we have a tendency to call everyone a witch. I've been called a witch and I'm a ceremonial magician, which is very, very different and a lot harder to mistake. But I mean, even now there are a lot of cultures where there are people who we would consider folk practitioners, but if you were to say you're a witch, would like slap you in the face.
I think that's culture to culture, and really to bear the brunt of that, the word witch. I am European, or of European descent at least. But I'm fully 100% Caucasian, and when we talk about, when we unpack the word witch, when we say the word witch, WITCH, that spelling, that word itself is very, very Eurocentric, and it does relate back to Europe. So me being of European descent, it makes sense for me to put that word on top of myself. However, if we're talking about people from a different culture, we can't just assign that word to them. It would be very colonial. It would be very Eurocentric to assign the word witch to someone whose culture did not actually contain that word, without us bringing in the languages of colonization, right? Like Spanish language has words for it, English language has words for it, Italian language has words for it, but those are still all European languages. So there is a discussion, and it's not this conversation, we probably won't unpack it here, but there is like a whole colonialism, post-colonial witchcraft and mysticism debate to be had in that as well.
I know that the debate I've heard a lot is like, and as this is from somebody outside of the practice, but I often hear that, because we'll be tying into this too, but I just want to know you guys' thoughts on it, that brujeria is just another word for witchcraft, and therefore everybody should be able to do it. And it sounds like such a bullshit argument, because why would people who speak English be using that term if the word witchcraft already existed? Like, it's clearly a distinction, even if like a literal translation would call it the same. It's not.
Well, yeah, I mean, why would you say a word in another language for no reason? It'd be like me being like, I'm a strega. Like, I mean, I'm not a witch. Like, if I was like, I'm a strega, why would I just not say witch when it's a word more people are familiar with in the US? It feels weird to not translate one word randomly. It'd be like if you were going around and being like if you just randomly started calling a chair like the word in Spanish. It's like that type of logic. It just feels weird to me. I don't get it. Like, if you're saying a word in a different language, it feels like it's for a specific reason, generally.
We're going to have to just acknowledge that I'm going to stumble through the words as I say them, because my Spanish vocabulary is como se dice. And once we get past como se dice, I'm not there. So, but in response, and I'm going to be more interested in Jay's response than my own, but brujeria is not the same thing as witchcraft in any way, shape, or form. And I think that's just a misunderstanding from an outsider's perspective, specifically from like Americans who do not have any form of relation to the cultures that it comes out of. I am not myself of descent of any, Spanish or Indigenous American or Central American nations, but I do live in Miami. So it's here, it's alive. And yeah, it's not at all the same thing as what I'm doing. It may look similar, it may feel similar, but we're not doing the same stuff.
Absolutely. And it's so unfortunate that people think that, the words brujeria and witchcraft are synonymous terms. They mean the exact same thing. So when people say they're a bruja, it means that they do Wicca. And that's something that we hear a lot these days. And that's so terrible right now. And we need to really, really move past it. And it's something that we're still dealing with modern colonization, because, is that technically the Spanish word for witchcraft? Yes, it is. But our views and our backgrounds and our history and traditions, as far as what we mean by witchcraft, these two words that are the closest ones that we have to one another, are so very different in practice and what they're about, and especially when it comes to modern witchcraft. So people do things like they write books on Wicca, and then they have them translated into Spanish, and they're using the word brujeria because in a technical sense, that is the correct word, but we're still talking about very, very different things. And when it comes to modern witchcraft, modern witchcraft is very doughy-eyed. It's very like, oh, we're all actually healers and we're here to make the world better, and we just worship nature. And then they try to then take that over to brujeria land And it is so very, very unfortunate because brujeria is not misunderstood, right? People are like, oh, brujas are really actually healers. And brujeria, like there was a book that came out talking about how brujeria is here for healing. No, in real Mexican countryside, brujeria is very dark. It's very forceful and it's very manipulative. People are afraid of brujas and brujos for a reason. This is not Wicca. We're talking magic that turns people into zombies and makes them love people that they don't love against their will. We're talking full control, like really terrible things that are rather unforgivable. And so when we talk about brujeria, we have to realize that there's a weight of culture and tradition about it that we can't just say, oh, well, technically it's the same word as Wicca, so we're just going to run with that. That's not how this works at all. And it can be very, very dangerous to assume otherwise.
Even beyond that, I mean, I think the like healing washing of all of occultism is problematic because when there are traditions that are based on healing and you start pushing that onto every tradition, it oversimplifies things, right? Because I get from an optics perspective wanting to be like, occultism is about healing because that makes us look better, right? But when you start saying that about practices you're not part of, it doesn't. I don't know. I think it's like optics. Sure, I get it, but I think it creates new misconceptions. I feel like across the board, but obviously specifically bad in that case.
It completely erases the history of a lot of these practices, especially, I hear it a lot with hoodoo. I imagine it might be the same with brujeria, but I'm not quite sure. Where, like, especially in hoodoo, I'll just go with that one. The reason that, like Christianity was adopted into it and a lot of the uses for the things that you'll find in there, like the reason why they're bad is because it was in part survival. They were using these against people that were enslaving them or hurting them. If we go with the love spell thing, like make them undeniably in love with you. Well, if the person enslaving you is in love with you, maybe they'll free you, maybe they'll stop harming you, maybe they'll give you benefits that you might not otherwise have had. Like, to say that it must be all love and light and healing and anything bad is always bad totally erases the history because, like, one, clearly they have not done any research into it, which only takes about 5 seconds, and two, you're completely diminishing the reason why people do bad things because sometimes it is for a good reason in the history.
100%.
Sometimes you need to hex a bitch. I'm sorry. And also, I'm going to say this is a hot take that even an outsider can come up with. In the entire history of occultism in every culture, there's going to have been one or two people who weren't just about healing because of the way humans are. Mm-hmm. Some people are not going to be about healing, and I'm going to guess some of our listeners may have done some things that weren't exactly about healing.
You know who you are.
Yeah, you know who you are. If you're listening to this, I'm talking about you.
You know what you
are
did.
Individually.
We know what you did.
You are the reason why we can't all be healing love and light Wicca individually.
Now, I think Nike brings up a really, really excellent point about the history of it. And that is something that really, really, really needs to be taken into account because so much of the stuff these days are like, oh, like I found this hoodoo death curse. I'm going to use it on this girl I don't like. And it's like, no, that was developed to use against someone who had enslaved you, your entire people, was beating you, branding you, like all this terrible things. Like we have to reframe this magic in a way that includes history because that's important. And then we have to wield it accordingly.
Well, the context of magic matters. And, when we talk about folk magic, magic is the magic of the people, right? So when you're looking at folk magic from the outsider's perspective, you need to take into account the people that it's stemming from. And every folk practice is going to be flavored by the things that those people went through and how they related to it. So, I'm going to skip us. Like, I know we wanted to touch on Santa Muerte later, but I'm going to bring her in now because let me tell you, I think that she's a misunderstood character, and I know you disagree with me. So I'm just going to put my opinion out there on why I think this, and then you can just go ahead and shred me for it. So this is about a year ago, and Nike and Georgina were actually live and in person for this event. We were all together when it happened. Some person on a Discord server got really, really mad at someone that we all mutually knew, and they decided that they were going to do this hex and call upon Santa Muerte to curse this other person through the internet, and they took some jar and they took some dead wasps and some vinegar and whatever, and they shook it up in front of a Discord server and did this live hex calling on Santa Muerte to, harm her and hurt her and all this other stuff, and made this deal with Santa Muerte to do this thing, which never panned out because it was never going to pan out. So I think that a lot of people of colonial descent, and I'm going to frame it that way specifically because I feel like the people who do misunderstand Santa Muerte specifically tend to be like white Americans. There is a big misunderstanding even within the paganism, witchcraft, spirituality communities, who this figure is, what her purpose is, how people contact her, the reasons why. And I think, her as an archetype, right? She's a very powerful archetype, but she's called upon by specific types of people, specific groups of people to work specific magic. And I would love to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. So coming back to that idea of, we have to have magic within context and take history into account. So when we first had the appearance of Santa Muerte, which was really not that long ago, and no one's completely certain of her roots. A lot of people will say that they know, oh, she came from this Aztec goddess or whatever, but the truth is we really don't know. She showed up, I want to say 70s or 80s, don't quote me on that, when Doña Queta showed up in Tepito with the first shrine to her. And the first image that we know of for sure. And at this time in Mexico too, and something that's still going on is the church has enormous power there. The Catholic Church has enormous power. And the Catholic Church also has been very much influenced by the upper class in Mexico. And there's a huge class divide. So we have a lot of lower class people, people who do not have the resources or access to things that the upper class has. And so they have to turn to things like crime, drug dealing, mugging, murder, things like this, in order to make money, in order to make sure that their family doesn't starve. And so where the first Santa Muerte shrine that Doña Queta put up is in a neighborhood, a barrio called Tepito, which is a very, very dangerous place. I had a friend who went there recently and was like, you have to get a gang member to escort you into the neighborhood to go see the Santa Muerte shrine. And people in that time, when you go to church, because of this influence from the upper class, churches were telling people, oh, if you're doing crimes, if you are doing any of these things that are against God, if you're murdering, if you're stealing, if you're running drugs, any of these things, then God doesn't love you. God turns his back on you, and so do all the saints. And so these people were left with nothing. And so then they had to turn and find someone who would accept them. Enter Santa Muerte. And that's something that I have a hard time with, because people say like, well, she's patron saint of the marginalized. And it's like, well, yes, but marginalized is very different in Mexico than it is in the United States. So we have people here in the United States who fall somewhere on the queer spectrum, but are otherwise cis, sometimes, hetero presenting, they're white, they're able, they, have money, things like that. But they're like, oh, I am somewhere under the queer umbrella. Therefore, she is my mother and she loves me and we work together and all this stuff. And that's not the same leap as it is, I have to mug people in order to make sure my family lives. And that means that God doesn't love me anymore, but this one will. So that's something that really, really needs to be taken into consideration. When it comes to modern views, especially modern American views on Santa Muerte, again, we really need to sanitize things in our culture for some reason. We need to make them more palatable. We need to take away their claws and stuff like that. So there's this whole big movement about, Santa Muerte, she's so very loving and she's nothing but love and light and bunny cuddles. And I'm like, are we forgetting that this is death? That this is death. And I think that people really need to take a moment to think about what that means before they call and summon death into their home to get a boyfriend or to get a raise at work. I'm like, you have other options. Pray to Saint Save-A-Ho and get it done that way. You do not need to summon death. So for a lot of people here in the United States, it's very much unnecessary to work with her. And when they do, I wish that they would take more precautions because she can be dangerous. She can be very dangerous. And even people who I've taken classes from who work with her very closely are like, yes, no, she's absolutely loving. You have nothing to fear. Just make sure that you pay her or else she will kill you. Anyway, she's wonderful. She's our mother. She's our madrina. And I'm like, wait, go back to that last thing.
Yeah, I'm completely removed from working with Santa Muerte. I have no reason to. I am not in the group that should. But something that I've always found interesting when I've seen it discussed online, coming from a complete outside perspective, is I've seen people talk about her. They're like, just give her offerings every day, and they're like, and you're good. And I was like, it's interesting that like they emphasized that so heavily, like you cannot miss an offering. And I'm like, that shows some dark, like not in a bad way. I mean, I work with some heavy stuff too, but like I always found that interesting.
Yeah, no, that's something that is really important. And a lot of people don't understand is that she's not an ATM and she's not Santa Claus just here to give you whatever that you want. She does deliver and she delivers very well. And people just think about that part and not the rest of her and what this means. But she does require devotion. She's not just one that, like a saint that you just light a candle to and ask for a favor. No, you need to be devoted to her. And you need to also be very specific about her payment. Because a lot of people do things like, oh, well, you know, that guy asked her for a bunch of stuff, but, you know, I'll bake her a cake in like a week or something like that. And they're not very specific on it. And they come home to, you know, pets that are dead, or they get into an accident, or people do things where they promise her something that they can't or don't intend to give. So it's really common for people to be like, oh, well, if you do this thing for me, I'm going to get a big chest tattoo of Santa Muerte. And then so she comes through for them, as she always does. And then they're like, oh, well, you know, I don't have the money for that, or maybe I don't want a Santa Muerte chest tattoo, but she's already come through. And then it gets very, very ugly for them. And for me personally, if my mother or my godmother or whatever it is that I'm working with here is someone that if I don't pay them, they're going to break my kneecaps, I don't call that a healthy, loving relationship.
It makes me think of like the American stereotypes of mafia bosses, like people who will borrow money from the mob because they're in a very desperate situation. If you pay, usually you're fine. You're now in with them and they may call on you later. But, you know, if you don't pay, they might not kill you, but they might kill your pets. They might set your car up to have some accidents. And if you die, you die. If you don't die, good job. There's your lesson learned. Like they'll ruin your life if you don't do it right. And it very much reminds me of that same energy of like, if you wouldn't like not pay back the mob, you shouldn't not pay back Santa Muerte.
100%.
I also find it interesting how we make every female deity into a mother. Across the board, it seems to be like this thing, like Hecate is mommy. I work with Lilith. Like I've seen people call Lilith mother, like, which Lilith would abort you, first of all.
Right.
But like I see this recurring theme where every goddess or female entity, even, because like call them mother, which I find a very interesting commentary on how we view femininity and spirituality in women, and just something to think about.
I could rant for ages about people calling Hecate motherly and soft and gentle. I'm like, are you serious? Like she has children and she has like creation energy, but her creation energy is not the same as like, you know, Hestia, Hearth and Home, like mother goddess energy. She's not Gaia, you know, she's not like Mother Nature. Hecate is not that kind of way. Like it's just so frustrating. And
nothing makes me laugh harder than Lilith as a mother goddess, because Lilith, people in like Samaria would make charms to prevent her from coming to kill their baby. Like there's this really specific one from the Sefer HaRaziel where it's this like little bird charm. It's really cute. I think I posted it on Instagram forever ago, that people would make to get Lilith away when they're pregnant. So I just think it's interesting how every female entity is a mother. Because some women are not motherly, okay? Some...
Me. I don't want kids.
Nike, you're my mommy. Mommy Nike. Yes. Mommy Nike. You're my loving mommy.
No, if anybody knew me in real life, they like y'all y'all know me enough online, but you haven't seen me physically like interacting with a baby. I as an aside, I have a few friends who have now had babies, and the first time meeting that like infants when they can't hold their own heads up, oh, it's very much like, I don't know how to hold them. I'm scared. I don't want to break them. Like, I don't have the motherly instincts. I don't want to have children. If I could go to the doctor and just learn that I was magically sterile, it would be the happiest day of my entire life. Like, I'm not a mother figure. I'm kind of mean in some ways, and I don't have the instinct of like, oh, let me hold this sweet child. Like, if they fall over, I'm gonna laugh at them. I like to say that I'd make a great uncle. But yeah, it'd be like, if you wouldn't call me motherly, you shouldn't call some of these deities or feminine entities motherly, because just because you are female presenting does not mean you're going to be motherly and sweet and gentle and caring and life-giving and nurturing. Like, it's not the way.
I want to touch briefly on before we like move on, but it's kind of in the same vein. Out of this group, half of us, two of us, have had the opportunity to read your book, and I'm not even intentionally plugging you, but specifically your book. And in the beginning, you mentioned like your book is called American Brujeria, and you talk about how you're specifically talking from the American perspective on brujeria. And I was wondering, what do you think are the biggest defining differences of American brujeria and like Central American brujeria, and where we see those like lines being crossed, especially like on the internet?
Absolutely. So I really, really wanted to differentiate that I was speaking about kind of America's version of brujeria, because I think it would be very, very damaging for me to write a book, simply call it brujeria, and then not have it be about, real traditional brujeria. And so the way that this book sort of came about was people were asking me to write a book on, real traditional Mexican countryside brujeria. And I don't know any of that. That is not my wheelhouse. And I know that hasn't really stopped many other people from writing about it, but I personally did not want to be one of those. And so, but then I realized, I'm like, oh, however, we as Mexican Americans, those of us who are living in the United States but are Mexican descendants, have a very specific way of working. And, and it's with the saint candles and the saint statues and all of the stuff and the prayers and the rosaries, and that we all watched our grandmas do, our abuelas and, our grandfathers as well. And this practice, it's essentially it's Mexican folk magic is what it is, which is different, kind of like how we were talking about how folk magic and witchcraft are different. Mexican folk magic and brujeria are also very different. So brujeria has very little to do with lighting candles to saints and praying the rosary and doing limpias and things like that. Real countryside brujeria does not have anything to do with that. But in the United States, those of us who are Latinx are practicing a type of folk magic right now that is very Catholic, it's very Mexican, it's all these things. And when you ask people, especially young people who are doing this work, what do you call this? What is it called? They'll be like, oh, it's called brujeria. And it's a lot of the time a joke, but people don't catch that so much. It's a little bit like when those of us who are Native American call ourselves or other people Indians. Like it's more of a joke. We don't really mean that we're Indians or we identify as it, but it's sort of a word that's fun to throw out there because it freaks people out, or whatever it is. We're gonna go do that brujeria, but it's kind of stuck. And so people who are Latinx in the United States practicing a Latinx form of magic will often refer to themselves as brujas or brujos or things like that, which I understand post-immigration, things like this change. We diverge from original tradition. And so I don't think it's inherently wrong as long as we understand that what we are calling brujeria in the United States is not the same thing as brujeria in Mexico. Those are two very different things. And so that's why I wanted to distinguish that with American brujeria, specifically talking about that.
Who can practice it? Let's just be real. Who can practice it? Do you have to be of, Central American or Spanish descent to practice this? Is there some kind of folk magic? this is my kind of rule of thumb, and I like to say this, and people can disagree with me. This is an opinion. Folk magic itself, to me, as an opinion, folk magic can never be closed practice, but individual styles of folk magic can be. Like cultures can close their individual practices and what they're doing. So in your opinion, do you think that this is what someone would consider on the internet, like closed practice, or can anyone learn this?
Well, according to the internet, absolutely everything is closed. Chewing gum is closed, breathing is closed, so we can't do anything. But I hesitate to say that it's open to everybody, because that's when just the flood of assholes happens. But something that I think is important to say is yes, it is open. Yes, other people can practice this. However, we need to keep in mind, of course, that we are borrowing from other cultures. We are a guest in another tradition, and it's important to remember that. So in my book, American Brujeria, drops May 1st, pre-order it now, shameless plug. I actually do spend a bit of time in the first chapter talking about this and giving guidelines for people who are not Latinx, who want to utilize this magic, and how to do so respectfully, and things to avoid, which I think is really important to talk about, because too many times these books with kind of these cultural magics just kind of go, everybody is welcome, and have zero context put around that, or guides or buffers or things like that. So I think it's very important that when we are working with the different cultures, that we have an awareness of that. So yes, technically it is open, but be respectful.
Yeah, I think respect is a big deal, because I was reading a ceremonial magic text from, it wasn't that long ago, it was from like 1870, 1880. And it said, it was about science, it was a line about scientific illuminism, which is an idea that came out of Hermeticism and Thelema mostly. So like really early stage Thelema, late stage Golden Dawn. And it said, we are not like the folk, it was basically like, we are not like the folk magicians who just do superstition, right? So it's even not that far back. You see like the high magician, which I don't like the term high magician, it's such a fucking it's such a classist term. Like seeing folk magic as inferior, as like something for poor women who don't, you know what I mean? Like there's a reason why, like even if something's open, I do think you need to be respectful and remember, like if you're from a tradition that really was cruel to another tradition, to be really mindful of that. Because there's a lot of sort of disrespectful stuff that people from further back said. Like there was this dichotomy between like the educated upper class men who thought they were like basically doing science when they absolutely were not. And they're like, we're nothing like them. And it's just really gross. And I think we should just be aware of that and like think about where we've came from. And let's not call folk magic lowly superstition, which is such a disgusting term. High ceremonial magic and folk magic, neither is better than the other. Like let's be real and treat stuff with the respect it deserves, and not internalize the opinions of people from the 1800s who didn't know what they were talking about.
No.
Well, I think something too that we need to consider as well is, of course, folk magic is irrevocably tied to the people it comes from. Hence why we call it folk magic. It's a people's magic. And so Queen Cotalia from Conjure South has a wonderful saying where she says, you can't practice folk magic if you don't know the folk, right? Because it's not going to make sense to you. Why we're doing these things is not going to make sense. That's why, like when it comes to things like voodoo dolls, right? People looked at a voodoo doll from outside of the community, went, oh, there's a human figure with nails stuck in it. They must be harming someone or punishing somebody. When in reality, each one of those nails is a promise, or a kind of a deal that you're making with the spirit in the doll. It has nothing to do with punishing other people. Well, it might, but that's not the idea, that you're putting pins in something and then they feel it on the other side, right? So you wouldn't get that though, unless you actually knew the people and why they were doing it. And so your folk magic is going to always fall flat unless you have this understanding of the culture and the people that it comes from.
And Voodoo Dolls is such a funny point, too, just as a brief aside, because it's also not Voodoo Dolls as they are called, but like poppets, little dollies, like that is a thing in other cultures as well. Like, I don't know how to pronounce it correctly. I'm going to mispronounce it. It's fine. In Greek folk magic, it's like kolosoi or something like that. But it's basically the same thing. It's like a little doll in the shape of a person that you like put herbs inside and you do whatever thing. And that's part of Greek folk magic. It's a thing from history, and it's not like appropriated from hoodoo, because it's just not really the direction that would work in. So, you know, a lot of these concepts exist in other things, and you know, I want to bring up the point about brujeria and about hoodoo. A lot of the ways that people view things that are connected verbally with them, like voodoo dolls, they don't connect those things to other religions or practices that use those same concepts. I'm gonna say it's because they aren't white or white passing or what we consider white and European and whatever.
There's a huge book, Scarlet Imprint released it, called Effigy, that explores the idea of human based, like making dolls and sculptures like people and all the magic with it from a ton of cultures. It's a really cool book. Just putting that in there. So it's a whole complex thing with the ideas of like effigies, and because it's wildly different culture to culture.
Every culture has had something of that nature. You know, and I think even Gemma Gary talks about it in her book Traditional Witchcraft. Like, it's a very big part of, you know, traditional Cornish magic too. And then we take into account like tradcraft, like it's in tradcraft. I think America, honestly, I'm gonna say this, and maybe Nike's gonna have to edit it out, I don't know. America creates a melting pot of folk magic. So we have, especially along the eastern seaboard, right, in the Appalachian region, we have a lot of flavors going on here because we had Irish Scottish immigrants. We had slavery happen here. We had, you know, the Native American indigenous population. There's a lot of, and then we had, you know, like Italian immigrants and modern day immigrants. And then we had
the Caribbean so close.
The Caribbean. And I mean, like I said, like I'm in South Florida. We were a Spanish colony. Louisiana, right, was part of, like, it had been through a number of European countries. So there's a lot of flavor going on over here, and it really does blur the lines of like what belongs. And I think really it's just the internet that gets like particular on what belongs to who, feeling like they need like total ownership over certain things. But the lines do get really blurry when we talk about specifically like American X practices, right? Like, because I say Irish folk magic because it's an easier description, but it's American Irish, you know, and a lot of people that I'm surrounded by, they're doing like American brujeria, or they're doing like American stregheria, or they're doing, you know, some type of, all of our lenses are being tinted through the lens of Americanism, post-colonialization, post-industrialization, and those are all factors to how our energy and our magic are coming across. You know, I think I'm like want to touch on something that we said, but we didn't get into it. I think we've touched on like Catholicism, I think, like once or twice through the conversation, and I think that's where the lines get really, to me, the lines get blurry, because not all mysticism should be or can be labeled witchcraft. It's my opinion they shouldn't be. And there's a lot of mysticism in Catholicism and tons of religions, you know, but just because Catholicism is heavily mystic doesn't make it witchcraft, and it doesn't make what they're doing folk witchcraft. You know, folk magic and folk mysticism and Catholic mysticism can exist separately without that label.
I strongly agree here. Even within Catholicism, you've got variants, right? You've got folk Catholicism, you've got folk magic that has Catholic connections, like a lot of forms of American folk magic. And then you've got like Catholic mysticism, what priests were doing. You've got the Catholic grimoire tradition, which is completely alien from, I mean, of course there was more overlap than we probably think there was, but like the Catholic high grimoire tradition, like that is so far from what we consider witchcraft. And then you've got all the folk traditions that come from Catholicism. So Catholicism probably has maybe not hundreds, but a lot of traditions that if you put them right next to each other would be alien. You know what I mean? They'd be so hard to compare. And I think the term witchcraft, I really don't like that it gets applied to everything personally. It kind of bugs me. I think a lot of people have started using witch just as a term for magic, to the point where I've seen people call straight pure mysticism, like I mean not like mysticism that crosses into witchcraft, like true, like I pray all the time to God to be as close to God as possible for hours every day witchcraft, which that is like so far that it's hard to even compare that. And I think this is a pet peeve of mine, right? That witchcraft just gets applied to everything, and the second you touch magic, you're a witch. I think that's very misinformed. I get why beginners do it. It makes sense, right? You get into it and you think magic equals witch. But yeah, I mean, like a lot of forms of Christian folk magic get labeled like Christian witchcraft. Like I know I began as an Appalachian folk practitioner. I'm from Appalachia. I don't live there now, but I grew up there. My family's been in Appalachia for a very long time. And I was an Appalachian folk person. And people were like, I didn't identify as a proper Christian. I was like a weird accidental Gnostic something. It's a whole can of, I was basically Gnostic. They're like, that's Christian witchcraft. And I'm like, I don't really think so. So
These
yeah.
two things are not the same.
Well, because what we call Christian witchcraft TM, right? Like people identify as Christian witches. That's a super new thing. And it's basically just like eclectic Wicca with Christian things on top of it, not like traditional Christian Catholic brujeria, Appalachian folk magic, hoodoo, like things that have Christian stuff in it, folk magic. Like Christian witchcraft seems to be a specific like rebrand of eclectic Wicca, eclectic witchcraft with Christian.
I would agree, because they do a lot of like I genuinely think part of the issue here is that we have no unifying body of definitions, right? Like no one has taken the time to just, and truly the community would not agree, but we don't have like a Webster's dictionary of spiritual terms and their definitions. So
My book idea. I'm gonna write a book on that.
There you go. I claimed it. I'm the one who just pitched it to the whole podcast. They heard me pitch this. We're gonna have to write it together.
Okay, yeah. We can call it the Isms Definition and Dictionary of Occultism.
Yes, we're gonna sell it to obscure publisher no one's ever heard of. But there's no unifying body, right? So in the 90s, anything that was witchcraft fell into the term Wicca, right? It was like all Wicca. And then we've like slowly been divorcing ourselves from Wicca and witchcraft and like making those separations. But I think so many people have divorced that, but then taken it and kind of like just kind of flung themselves away from it really, really hard, so that we can only view the world through the lens that we understand it, at the level we understand it, through the lens we understand it. So if our words for language have been taken, like if we've decided, okay, I'm not using Christian's lens, like a Christianity's lens anymore, I'm going to throw these new pagan words on top, but there's no unifying body to determine what these words mean. They're just saying things. So like, okay, I'm a Christian witch. Like, what are you doing though? Because like, and you know, I've seen people online like Jesus was a witch. Like,
I'm just gonna say every mystic is screaming. I have some friends who are straight up Jewish Kabbalists and like pure mystics, and like I'm gonna tell them that they're witches and just see their reaction. Yes. I'm gonna be like, yes. I love discussing witchcraft with you, and they're like beat me over the head with a Torah scroll.
I love that. I definitely subscribe to the Jesus was a witch thing, but only because it freaks people out and I really love it. It's really important, I think.
Okay, that's true. That is true. Actually, I'm in for shock value. So you know what? My opinion has changed.
Out of the three of us, four of us, out of the four of us, but the three of us that are regular hosts, none of us are Christian. You are Christian. So what is your perspective on Christian witches? Do they exist? Can they exist? Should they exist? What are they doing? What's going on?
I think when it comes down to that question, it's a matter of language and nuance. And for me personally, if people want to identify as Christian witches, I'm like, fine, whatever, you're not hurting anybody. I'm okay with it. But it's a little bit like when we have like Jews for Jesus. And I'm like, I hate to tell you, but but as somebody who kind of walks that line too between, you know, what a lot of people would label as witchcraft, because as we've been talking about, we label everything mystical witchcraft these days. I can see the appeal. I can see kind of where they're heading with it and what they're trying to do. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I guess we could just leave it probably there. Like, I get what you're trying to do. I'm not thinking that this is going to be exactly what you think it is, but as long as you're not bothering anybody, I'm fairly okay with it as far as the term Christian witch is concerned. And that seems to be much less of a hot topic these days as opposed to other terms that we're dealing with right now. Like baby witch is like the biggest hot topic as far as should we use it, should we not? And I think that one's a scarier conversation than the Christian witch one, to be honest. But yeah, no, it doesn't freak me out. I think as long as people are willing to unpack it to the extent it needs to be, then all right, fine.
I feel like the Christian witchcraft thing was a hot take a couple years ago. It was a really hot conversation a few years back, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely.
Everything comes around, you're an active member and you go to church every Sunday. And you do what you do, knowing that 200 years ago you would have burned your neighbor for doing what you're openly saying that you're doing, but you're still showing up at church. Like, cool, I guess that's what privilege looks like. So
it's true. But like at the same time too, growing up Catholic and then converting to, witchery and then back to Catholicism, it all looks the same to me. I'm like, you go to church, you light a candle, you ask for something. You do witchcraft, you light a candle, you ask for something. I mean, it all looks about the same to me. So I can see the temptation to just kind of put them into the same basket with one another. But again, we need to kind of give context, history, things like that a gander before we completely decide that these two things are the same.
I would love your opinion. Okay, I'm going to give my take. I kind of want the other two's takes. I want your take. Okay, I know that I got into like a little bit of a thing with this recently, but you just said it. All right, my opinion, growing up with a Catholic mother, growing up around the church, not being Catholic anymore. When Catholics ask for something, okay, if they're lighting their candle and they're doing their multi-day prayer, okay, they're asking for divine intervention. And when a witch is doing something, they're forcing their will specifically to change the situation. They're not asking for divine intervention. And that is why I don't think that Catholic prayer is the same as witchcraft in the term of spell work. I know now, like the words, because we have no common definition. So someone in our comments is going to be like, spells relate to spelling and words, and it is the spell. So like, I know.
Wait, spell relates to words. So that means Enochian magic is spell work because it's spoken.
We're gonna get those people. Just know, every time I make this argument, people are like, spells relate to words and spelling. And
so then talking is spell work?
Yeah.
When I tell someone to get away from me so I can pass them in the street, is that spell work?
Spell, yeah. It's a hate spell.
It's a curse.
Casting all willy-nilly.
I curse every day during my commute.
But yeah, but that's like, some people have that interpretation of the word, so that's why it's a messy conversation. But to me and my understanding at this point, my knowledge and my own experience, Catholics ask for divine intercession. They're not pushing their will to change the outcome. So, in the event of, like, let's say, my mother gets sick, I'm praying to God to heal her. I'm not saying I'm going to heal her. Whereas if I'm doing folk magic, I'm doing magic specifically to try and heal the issue. I'm not asking for that intercession. I'm not asking for that divine intervention. So I want everyone's opinion, because I posted this on Twitter and got hate mailed out of it. So,
well, that's interesting to make me think, because since I do ceremonial magic, everything I do is spirit-based, really, right? Like sometimes I do compulsion where I like make the thing do what I want, but I'm always asking for divine intervention, right? Like I don't do a lot of folk magic. I don't do a lot of it myself. What I'll do is I'll like invoke some specific spirit and be like, hello, friend. It's a lot more aggressive than praying over a candle for a few days, but it is quite similar, as Chloe said, inflame yourself in prayer as a principle of invocation. So you know what? I agree with you, because I wouldn't consider that spell work, right? Like when I do some planetary invocation at some weird hour, right? Like it's not really spell work. I call it ritual work.
Ritual, right? Like that would
Probably
be more
ritual,
ritual
yeah.
or religious, but it
Well,
wouldn't
yeah, well, I
be-
consider everything I do religious. For me, my practice and my religion are not separate at all, which I know is not true for a lot of people. I consider like religion and my practice like they're like this.
This is opinion hour. This is an opinion.
Yeah, so I agree with you actually. I think when I think of spell work, I think of doing it yourself. I think of a lot of like sympathetic magic comes to my mind first, like immediately, right? Because for me, that's kind of the most naturally logical thing to do, right? With the microcosm. But yeah, no, I agree with you. I think so. I don't think that's spell work. I think spell work is a different thing, but I think they do have overlapping themes and could look similar from the outside. So I think it's a little bit of a subjective conversation.
It's subjective based on your definition and your understanding of what they are.
Well, my view on it is the same way that I view, like, if we use pagan terminology that witches are used to using in the online sphere, blah, blah, blah. My feelings on, like, Christian witchcraft and like, praying to God and doing the candles versus what is spell work is deity work is not the same as spell work. And we understand that from the pagan perspective, so why does it become muddy with Christianity? If you replace, like, Yahweh, God, Jesus, the saints, with any other pagan deity, spirits, whatever, you wouldn't call praying to Freya spell work, so why would you call praying to Yahweh or God or Jesus or the saints spell work? You wouldn't. It's the same concept, just change out the words, and I think it becomes like a biased thing of, how do I put this? It's hard to explain how I view it. I think it comes from wanting to divorce Christianity from how we understand it in, like, the American sense of what it is, and we're trying to make it more mystical, but you're sort of ignoring the reality of it to make it more sort of fantastical and palatable and comfortable, and make it, like, it's people trying to make Christianity pagan. That's the way it is. Like, it's not spell work to pray to the saints, it's not spell work to pray to God, it's just praying. It can be powerful, it can be helpful, it can be useful. Like, it's not lesser, and it's not diminishing what it is. It's just not the same.
I agree on a lot of accounts, especially talking about the idea between, asking for something from a higher up versus making it happen. And a lot of times in Christian, folk magic or, Christian witchcraft, whatever we're going to call it, it does tend to lean very heavily on, if it is your will, let it be, asking for help from above. On the flip side of that, though, we also have things that are very powerful that aren't necessarily asking God's permission. So, for instance, things like the names of God are very, very powerful. And in utilizing that does not necessarily mean that God comes down and says, oh, I heard my name, I'm going to do this thing, but just the name itself holds so much power that you can make something happen with it, whether God is involved or not, which I think is really important to talk about. So, like, in the Bible, there's this really weird part in it where Elisha goes to a new town and a bunch of kids follow him around making fun of the fact that he's bald. And so Elisha turns around and, like, quote, curses them in the name of God, and 2 big ass bears just come out of the forest and eat 42 children.
Yeah,
right?
Well, that's why the LBRP is so, I think, cool, because the LBRP is extremely heretical, really, because you're vibrating the names of God, and then you say the unspeakable name or the tetragrammaton, Yod He Vav He, which is, like, completely unspoken, right? People use 72 other names in place, which all of them have power. So saying the unspeakable name is extremely intense. Like, hyper-religious Abrahamists generally, like the Orthodox sects, tend to never say it or write it. It's very, very forbidden. So if you guys, this is my sales pitch to do the LBRP. It's very heretical. Make a priest uncomfortable. Do an LBRP. Kidding, I'm kidding.
But
I'll make a priest uncomfortable today.
I'll stop shilling it.
I love that you brought up a curse in the Bible, because I want to talk about another one, my favorite one, and there's never going to be another episode where I'm going to be able to talk about this, right? There's a section of the New Testament. It's Passion Week. Jesus is about to be crucified, hasn't happened yet, and he's about to enter a town, and he stumbles upon a fig tree that is barren, and he curses the fig tree, and he says, because you do not have fruit, you'll never have fruit again. You will wither and die, blah, 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 blah. And the only thing that we can see, because now this is talked about in two different books of the Bible, that there's 2 accounts of it. And it's really not talked about in a lot of depth. Just Jesus walks upon this fig tree, is like, fuck you.
Fuck this fig tree.
It, yes, kills it dead, leaves, comes back through the next day doing something else. And there's like a small commentary on like how the fig tree was dead. And then that's it. Like, that's a parable for something bigger, and you have to tie it into Passion Week. You actually do have to give it the context of what it was in. A lot of people take that Jesus cursing story out of context, because like you really do need to take all of the events that are about to occur together. But
he was under a lot of stress.
And like there's a whole lot more going on there, like theologically. Like it was symbolic of the fall that was about to happen, and like cursing of nations, and there's like a whole bunch of stuff there. So but like there are a lot of examples of this kind of behavior from people that we would not expect. We wouldn't expect Jesus to do that. We wouldn't expect, I love to see it.
I love it. I love a good biblical curse. Well, and this is also true where a lot of people have a big misconception about the term, don't take the Lord's name in vain. They think it means don't say, oh my God, but really what we're talking about is like not, using the name of God in order to make something happen for, frivolous purposes. This isn't something you just pull out for anything. Well, I guess if children are making fun of you, you can pull it out then. But, it's talking about, don't overuse this. This isn't a thing that you should just be whipping out all the time, which I think is important to differentiate what they're talking about there.
Only for barren fig trees and bad kids.
Yes.
Fuck fig trees. This is an anti-fig tree podcast.
Put that on the graphic. This podcast graphic needs to have a fig with an X.
No more fig trees. Curse them.
Curse fig trees.
If you put that in the Discord chat, I can make it happen.
I'm sorry. Jay can't see it, but Georgina made a meme about Jesus. Like, I'll have to text this to you. It's like, I'm kind of dying. I'm trying to keep it together. Hold on.
It's that like brain evolution thing, and it's like level 1 is Jesus was the Son of God, Jesus was a witch, Jesus was a demigod, Jesus was the Scarlet Woman of Yahweh.
Oh God, definitely said that to me because that's the best.
Which is a true take. Jesus is the Scarlet Woman of Christianity.
If there's only one thing that our podcast could ever get across, all right, I just texted it to you. If there's only one thing our podcast could get across, I'm glad that it could be this today.
We're jumping into this because we just had a whole fun conversation that'll be in the pre-show bonus stuff. So if you want to see more of that, Patreon's always a good time for that. And now we'll do all of our wrap-up stuff. Do you want to do final thoughts and then our patron thank yous, or patron thank yous and then final thoughts?
Final thoughts first.
Final thoughts.
So my final thoughts are that folk magic is a rich and complex topic. It's not all one tradition. The dichotomy between a folk magician and a witch, they're not the same thing. It's not a full dichotomy, but they're definitely not the same thing. And I think we should be intentional with the words we use and not call everyone a witch.
My final thoughts is our grammar. Final thoughts. Folk magic is everywhere, and just because you see one thing in one tradition does not mean that the same or a similar concept doesn't exist in other ones. If you look around a little, you'll see a lot of similarities, and it's not that hard to find them.
My final thoughts are: be intentional with who you're calling in and the purpose in which you're calling them in for. They'll save your practice more than you realize.
My final thoughts are that folk magic proves that magic itself as a practice does not belong specifically to paganism, and therefore we should broaden that definition a little bit and allow different types of people to come to the table when it comes to magic.
And we're going to thank our patrons. So patrons, you help us keep the show alive and keep us, able to spend more time doing this and being able to do special things for you. So extra special thanks to Maria Corin, Kat. I finally learned how to say this name because I apparently didn't see it last time and they did already tell me. Jay Lee, Jay Lee, thank you very much. You're very cool and special. Evan Owens and Barry King. Thanks, y'all.
And this has been Occultism with a Side of Salt.
I'm keeping that in. I'm so keeping that in.
No, you're
Then
not.
you're gonna have to redo it because I laughed over you. All right, we're keeping it.
And this has been Occultism with a
We're keeping all of this. We're keeping all of this. I
And
don't
this
even
has
care.
been Occultism with a. And this has been Occultism with a Side of Salt.
Are you gonna close yourself out? Like, say your name and where they can find you.
Oh shit! So we're redoing the end. So this has been Georgina Rose. You can find me under .darling on YouTube, Twitter, TikTok, every platform, and Patreon. And you can support the show with Occultism with a Side of Salt by joining our Patreon, where you get extra episodes, bonus content, and pre-shows if you want more content than you already have to suffer through every week.
I won't be able to do this too clearly without laughing. My name's Nike. You can find me at Warrior Witch Nike pretty much everywhere. YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, Warrior Witch N, all the fun stuff.
I'm Temperance Alden. You can find me at Wildwoman Witchcraft on Instagram and TikTok. Temperance Alden on Twitter. My book Year of the Witch is available everywhere books are sold, but it's easier if you just find it at a bookstore.
And I am Jay Allen Cross. You can find me at Oregon Wood Witch on Instagram as well as Twitter. And don't forget to order my new book, American Brujeria, available through Wiser Books, available for pre-order now, comes out May 1st.
It's really, really good.
And
Like, it really is so good.
And this has been Occultism with a Side of Salt.